actually came to New Brunswick as an undergraduate at Rutgers in 1968. Graduated in 72. Went to Brooklyn Law School, where I actually lived in Woodbridge, in the Avenel section of Woodbridge, while I commuted to law school. When I graduated, I came back and I moved into, yes? Yes?
Excuse the interruption.
You can't interrupt me. I then came back and I lived in Edison for a year, then moved into New Brunswick in Tove Manor. So I lived in New Brunswick 68 through 72, and then in 1975 moved back into New Brunswick at Tove Manor. I was admitted in New Jersey in 75 to practice, and I practiced with a gentleman you may have heard of, Kenny Weiner, who was an attorney in East Brunswick, and worked there for a short period of time, and then opened my own law practice in 1977 in New Brunswick with Bob Gluck. And that's how we ended up in New Brunswick. So at that point in time in 77, I now had a law practice in New Brunswick, and I lived in New Brunswick, and that's kind of how I've been in New Brunswick ever since, both practicing and living.
So you still live in the city of New Brunswick? Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I lived in Tove Manor in an apartment from 77 to 79. Then I bought a house on Sycart Street.
Oh, okay.
And lived in that house on Sycart Street until 1982, and then got married in 82, bought a home in Dewey Heights, and I've been in the same house since 1982. So, married a lifelong New Brunswick resident.
Oh,
My wife's
okay.
a lifelong New Brunswick resident. And early on in my practice, I did, in the first few years, kind of did most anything, but I did a lot of real estate and land use work. But I met John Lynch in the late part of 1977, when John at that time actually was screening with the 17th District Committee for the Senate seat, which had been held by his father. Now ultimately that Senate seat at that time actually went to Bill Hamilton. Bill Hamilton ended up being 17th District Senator.
Oh, really?
But that's actually how I first met John.
Okay.
John at that time was also the Democratic chairman in New Brunswick. And if you may recall that time, at that time Dick Mulligan had been the mayor, but Dick had left during the course of his term, and Gilbert Nelson was appointed as the interim mayor at that time. And I point that out only because that's the time when I first got engaged really in the political side of the city of New Brunswick, being more than just I happen to live here. Now I became more engaged in the city. And in the beginning of 1978, got more involved in the Democratic organization. At that time, John made the determination to run for mayor. And early on in 1978, when he made that decision, he and I met, and he asked me to become actively involved in his campaign. And as it turns out, I became his campaign manager during that mayoral campaign, which is one of the things that I'll always remember. My first time really in a real political environment, in a campaign, and you may recall that was the one where John ran against George Hendricks in a primary. And it was,
you may remember that.
Actually, it'd be good for the record if you could
yeah, it was an
campaign.
interesting one because that was a very high-profile primary election, which really in New Brunswick, of course, the primary by and large determined the outcome of an election. Although obviously we had a general election where John ran. But I became very much involved in the political side, got to know John very well, got to know the running mates and all the committee people and the Democratic chair at that time after John stepped down to run, Jack Buckley became the chair of the organization.
Okay.
So my start in New Brunswick, my activity really centered around the political arena. And obviously it was one of those things where I had time. I had a growing practice, but it was one of those things where I really had time to commit to this. And I think John actually was looking for someone like that, someone who could devote the time to the campaign and be involved and learn in the process, but actually do a lot of the street work that needs to be done in a campaign like that. So I did learn a lot, got to know a lot of people, got to be involved in what ended up to be a very successful campaign. And I learned a lot about the city during that process, which I think was very important because I didn't know a lot about the wards, didn't know about a lot about the history of the different wards, whether it's the Hungarian ward, the Irish ward, and just knowing a little bit about the history really went a long way for giving me a sense of what the city of New Brunswick was all about. Not only where it stood at the current time, but the history of the city. And so that was really helpful for me to get that. And it served me well because soon after John became mayor, his law firm had actually been general counsel to the New Brunswick Development Corporation.
I see.
And since John had been elected mayor, the firm no longer would play that type of role, would actually serve in that capacity. And I was contacted by the Development Corporation whether if I would be interested in serving as their general counsel. So I said yes, of course, and I became general counsel to Devco in January of 1979. And that was a key time, just really when I think the revitalization process really took off. Now, as you know, a lot of the apparatus was put in place within the few years before that. The creation of NBT, the creation of Devco, really the kind of like the creating the framework was all done in 1976, 1977 through the efforts of a number of people, including John, before he was mayor. But it was really in that 1979 into 1980 where it really took off, in my view, largely because John now became mayor and very much attuned to let's get going and make things happen. So I kind of really was in the ground floor, if you will, of where, you know, the role that Devco and NBT played. I was right there in the beginning playing a significant role, which was kind of, when I look back on it, was, I mean, when you're young, you're naive, but I was very young when you consider the fact that I was acting as general counsel to Devco and I was still not even 29 years old yet. So I was still pretty young when I got involved in it. And so my first primary role, and one that I played and still play a role with Devco, was acting as general counsel at Devco. So because of that, I was involved in almost every redevelopment project that
I didn't actually realize that.
Yeah,
that you're involved in
almost every redevelopment project since the beginning.
Wow. Okay.
Now there have been obviously projects and initiatives that have taken place that Devco was not directly involved in many cases indirectly. But for example, the J&J headquarters, things of that nature. I didn't represent J&J in that, but very much aware of what was going on because it fit into you know, the overall scheme of what was happening in the downtown. But I can recall, and some of the things, you know, kind of stick in your mind. I remember in 1979, I did the first real estate closing for the first land acquisitions for the development of the Hyatt Hotel, and then ultimately then expanded into the Hiram area and what now is Riverwatch. But much of the controversy and the dialogue surrounding the Hiram Market and how the Hiram Market was going to be either maintained as an historic district or whether it was going to be redeveloped, how it was going to be redeveloped. So I have vivid memories of things like those property acquisitions, the dialogue over the King Block building, or whether the King Block building was going to remain or whether it was going to be preserved historically on the record but not maintained physically. And I kind of look back at those times and I think, gee, you know, as a young man, I really was involved in something very significant. And that project, of course, the Hyatt Hotel and the development of that, I did did do all the legal work for that, including all the construction documents and all the closing documents, the financing, and some of those things stick in your mind because I recall that during the construction period of the Hyatt Hotel, the interest rates were over 16%. And it was one of those things we look at today, and we look at interest rates being so low, and they were so high then. Yet because, I think in a lot of ways there was a lot of luck involved in it, I think, but you had the staying power and the willpower of the people that were in leadership roles to make it happen.
Were properties acquired via eminent domain, or how was the assembly done?
Most of in the Hyatt Hotel area, I would say most of the properties were acquired privately, but all of them as a result of being in a redevelopment area. So, some of them were a little bit more difficult to negotiate than others, and some were ultimately taken through eminent domain. If in eminent domain, you can really look at two ways: the contested taking, or not necessarily the contesting of the taking, but the contesting of the amount. And for the most part, I think in most of the eminent domain actions that you see even today, the issue is more about how much, not about whether it's going to be taken or not. So I was involved in a lot of the redevelopment and eminent domain processes representing the developer, meaning New Brunswick Development Corporation. And I worked very closely with John Hoffman and the Lentz firm, who even at that time in the late 70s was representing the redevelopment authority as the attorney for the redevelopment authority, and they still play that role today. So ever since I first got involved in redevelopment, I was dealing with John Hoffman with redevelopment agreements and the property acquisitions and so forth. So he's one individual, if you haven't spoken to, he could probably give you a lot of insight as well, because he's been involved in the process as the attorney for the redevelopment authority from the very beginning. And we, again, with that project, I can recall even the first constructed building that.
This is the Hyatt.
Well, it was as the New Brunswick Development Corporation, the Plaza 2 building. I recall.
The IMK building.
No, the Plaza
The
2,
first.
which is the Plaza 2
The
building
white
is the red building. Plaza 1
okay.
is the white building.
Yes.
Plaza 2 is the red building.
Right.
And that was one of the first buildings that was actually completed as a
Okay.
result of the redevelopment process through the efforts of New Brunswick Development Corporation.
Okay.
And that's why I recall that one vividly, because I remember doing the permanent loan closing, and at that time you didn't wire the monies, you had checks, and I remember having this very large check in my trust account. And as a young lawyer, those things kind of stick in your mind. But
Right.
I think that I had I would say, the privilege of being involved with Devco so early, because as the attorney and general counsel, I was secretary to the board, so that I was at all the board meetings and was able to interact and really, from my perspective, listen and absorb the things that were happening at those board meetings by the people early on who were very much involved in the decision making and the redevelopment process. And that includes John Heldridge, it includes Len Hill, Bill Tremaine, and probably most importantly, Dick Sellers. When I first came on board as general counsel, Dick Sellers was chairman of the board at Devco, and he was still the chairman over at J&J. So, and that was significant, and for me, it was quite a privilege to be sitting there and being a part of those discussions, and mostly taking minutes with being there.
Was anyone from Rutgers on the board at that time? Was Ed Blaustein?
Ed Blaustein was not on the board. The answer to that is yes, but I can't recall exactly who was representing Rutgers on the board, but there was a Rutgers
So there may have been a Rutgers representative at New Brunswick tomorrow.
Yeah, well, there definitely was on New Brunswick tomorrow, but I also believe there was a Rutgers representative on Devco. I just can't recall.
Okay.
And there was changeover. There were
Right.
people that were on and off. People like High Center, he was on the board. Oh, Alvin Rockoff.
Oh, okay.
Alvin Rockoff.
Right.
And I think Alvin probably and for a long period of time was probably the most profiled Rutgers person on the Devco board. I would say
He was
there
on
were
the
other-
board of governors or board of trustees.
Board of directors.
Board-
Devco was.
No, but on Rutgers board.
Yes,
Yeah, right.
yes. So it was a cross-section on that board.
Mhm.
You know, the business community at that time, Bill Tremaine was a executive at Prudential. And of course, Dick Sellers, John Heldridge from J&J. You had Len Hill from at that time, National Bank of New Jersey. Roy Epps from the Civic League. High Center. And there were others that were in and out, but that early on, those were the people that stick it in my mind. And I think that I always felt that Dick Sellers was such a critical early leader in revitalization, certainly because I'm sure that he probably was the single most important decision maker with respect to Johnson & Johnson deciding to stay in New Brunswick. But also I think that he had the persona to be able to interact with in the political arena with people like John Lynch and even county representatives, and it always seemed to me to be a very, very strong, positive working relationship that he had, and he also has that charisma. I mean, he was a very charismatic guy, and I think that gave everybody a significant comfort level of J&J's commitment to the city. But I continue to.
And how would you describe the role of Devco? I mean, I generally know. But,
Well, in looking back as to conceptually how the revitalization structure was set up, and again, it was set up immediately before my time, but understanding what the intent was through the efforts of the American Cities Corporation and Leo Molinaro. And Leo was a great guy. He came in periodically, and even years later came back on request from the city to just kind of do a snapshot view of where we are and things that we could be doing differently. But structurally, it was set up such that, as I understood it, NBT was intended to be the ideas entity, to create the strategic planning, and that Devco was the implementation arm. That, in theory, was how I believe it was set up. I think as a practical matter, it didn't evolve that way, although they worked very closely together. I think as the years and the process evolved, I think it took on more of a different view. Devco really...
The development versus the more social side.
Right, yeah. NBT ended up more on the human side of things. Social services, the people, the neighborhoods, the community structure that was necessary to develop along with the city. And that Devco really was its own strategic and implementing entity. Now, they worked obviously very close together. You had cross-board participation. John Heldridge played a very significant role in that, being so much involved in both. But I think I always thought that the theory of the setup never operated that way, but it operated very well. And I think that it allowed for a lot of continuity, even when there was change in the leadership of Devco. When I say leadership, the professional leadership, through the different presidents, that there was always a strong working relationship with the city. And that I think it worked very well to have the strategic planning side and the implementation side together. I always thought it worked pretty well that way. Always never losing sight of the important role that NBT was playing in making sure that the community at large was being serviced as best it could through the redevelopment process. I think that there are a couple of kind of generic questions that I know are kind of out there that I've had a lot of time to think about, and actually over the years have thought about it. Why were we so successful in New Brunswick? And I believe we have been very successful. It doesn't mean everything's perfect, but I think we've been successful. And to a great degree, it's because of, I think, political stability. Stability meaning there, through all of these years, you essentially had two mayors, which is fascinating when you think about it. And I think also there was, a stability within the council, and the council working hand in hand and understanding the process. And I think it was important to have that kind of political stability. You can argue whether one party, two party is a good thing or a bad thing, but I think I'm just looking at it practically. It served a purpose here because there was a lot of political stability. There was the ability to know that if people were going to invest in the city, if people were going to either invest money, resources, time, whatever it is, they knew that leadership, if it told you it could produce something, it could do it, by and large. And I think that was important, to be able to give people the confidence to invest in the city. I think that the private side, and private side meaning J&J, but other corporate entities or non-corporate, but people, whether it's the merchants, anyone who is going to commit themselves to the city, I think had that feeling that it was going to be a stable place. And I think that was very important. And I think that one can argue, and I think it's been argued a lot, J&J's commitment to the city was critical. The question always you got to ask yourself, have they really done as much as they could? Because you always could think they could have done more. And what was the net effect of J&J staying here in the long run, and to the extent, are the people who are there physically in the building, are they really participating on a day-to-day basis in the downtown? I still think that's a debate that people can disagree on. I personally have always felt that there was more that they could have and should have done within the city, but no one would argue that they haven't done a lot. I would never say that. But sometimes I've thought, as a resident and being here so long, that you'd like to see more interaction, see people not being necessarily discouraged from coming into the downtown, but encouraged to come in, and the retailers. And I think more so today because we become such a destination for restaurants and the theaters and so forth. But I think that the point that I started out was, I think the stability of leadership and the political stability was very important. I also think that another reason why the city was successful is that we weren't too big that you couldn't see results. I look at cities like Camden, and I look at Newark, and for all the efforts that you may have in those places, you sometimes think, can you ever really do enough to make a difference? The city is 5.5 square miles. It's got a defined downtown. It's got natural resources in the university, in J&J, in the cultural district, in the county seat. You had all of these things that were there, and yet you could do a project and make a difference because it's meaningful within a 5.5 square mile radius physically. And I always thought that was very significant. We weren't so big that you couldn't see positive results. I think another aspect that is critical, and I don't think I would say we were lucky, but we were certainly fortunate, and that is that we had a definable theater district and the ability to do something about it. The State Theater and I guess this is, we are, we're, as much as anyone, very sensitive to this. The State Theater was a jewel that the city had that early on it was recognized by strategic planners, but also, in the political arena and in the J&J arena, that it was critical that we maintain it, preserve it, get it up and operational, and to create a live theater presence within the city. It was critical. And it's one of the things that I always will remember, and I think points out the person I've mentioned already, and that's Dick Sellers, how critical a role that he played in that, because I don't know that most people realize that when the State Theater was in private ownership and it was a porno house, that the property was acquired through the use of Dick Sellers' personal assets.
Yes, I've heard that.
And he preserved it so that it didn't fall into the wrong hands. And as it turns out, we ultimately refinanced it through the use of EDA refinancing bonds, which were the first refinancing bonds issued by the state of New Jersey through the EDA.
Right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Very first ones by the EDA in New Jersey. So it's
And
things.
the refinancing bonds are what? If you can
Well, in
just
other words,
describe
the EDA will issue financing for new acquisitions or new projects. In this case, the cultural center already owned the facility through the pledge of Dick Sellers' assets. So the EDA wouldn't normally say, well,
them.
you already own
It
it.
allowed you to take funds out.
Right, it allowed him to get his personal assets out
Mhm.
and restructured our debt through the use of those EDA refinancing
Mm.
bonds. And that was critical for us.
All right.
And, you know, it's one of those, again, these assets that we have in the city that made us unique and I think capable of being successful.
Mhm.
And to be able to develop around the State Theater the way that we did. And it's one of the things also that I was privileged to be able to be an early participant in. The New Brunswick Cultural Center.
Can you talk more about that? So I
Yeah,
think it's given the importance.
Sure.
of this.
The New Brunswick Cultural Center Board was formed in 1982. I know that because I was one of the original 5 board members. Again, really there in my capacity as an attorney, but I was charged with the responsibility to create the original documents where we formed the Cultural Center Board. The original 5 members of that board were Dick Sellers, myself, Jane Tublin, Sam Landis from Highland Park, and I think of the 5th one.
Was Bill Wright on it then?
No, Bill Wright came in as president. It was Sam Landis. Oh, Ralph Voorhees was the 5th member.
Okay.
And we did all the legal work that was necessary to create the entity, to form an initial board, and then immediately go into the study, which Bill Wright was very much involved with, the
Okay.
study of the cultural center, leading up to the creation of the board. But then Bill came on board as the president of the
Mhm.
organization. But it was critical to be able to get a structure in place which not only would just simply own the facility, but would be able to operate it and operate it successfully. And one of the things that I've learned over the years, and I think Thea can bear out because she sat there in the same capacity, is that buildings are great and you can put a ton of money into these places,
Mhm.
but if you can't operate them
Right.
professionally, successfully, and financially viably, it doesn't mean anything. And I think that we were able to put a structure in place which had credibility, that had a board that had credibility. Once again, I like to give Dick Sellers a lot of early credit for that. Again, early on though, with John Heldridge and Ralph Voorhees playing such key roles that they have and continue to play, I think that the structure was put in place early on to be successful. And the Cultural Center and the State Theater specifically is another example of how, when we say we had these assets already here, and we had the political stability to make it happen, that paid actual, tangible results. An example. Yes, Dick Sellers put his assets up to allow the New Brunswick Cultural Center to buy that building. But it could have never opened without some other source of funds to go into that building to get it opened initially in the 80s. Where did that come from? It came from Middlesex County. How did Middlesex County do it? Middlesex County acquired the building from the Cultural Center for $3 million and leased it back to the Cultural Center for $1 a year for 99 years. What did that do? It was a simple mechanism to put $3 million into the building to get it to a point where you could open it up. And if you didn't have the cooperation of the Middlesex County government, the city government, and the Cultural Center board to look at that and say, that's a good way to get this facility up and operational, it would have never happened. So again, we had these assets here already. The county government's been here for a long time. The city government's been here a long time. But it was far-thinking leadership. It was a willingness to cooperate, and the stability of knowing that you could get that done and it would be successful. And it has been successful. And as it turns out, and I think the year that actually happened was 84 or 85, because we ultimately ended up opening, I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think in April of 88. I think it was 88.
I was going to say 87, 88.
I think it was
Right.
April of 88, because it took a while to do all the refurbishment that went on that first go-round. And now, years later, when we fast forward, once again, we went back to the county of Middlesex, and were able to get an additional $3 million from the county, this time through a wholly different financing source, which was open space funds, which, between 1988 and 2003, a new law was created and a new source of funds. And we were able to take that $3 million and put it into the building to make it what it is today. So
was that one of the first uses of open space monies for that purpose?
it was the first use by Middlesex County of open space funds for use in historic restoration. The principle under which the law allowed those monies to go into the theater was because it met the definition of an historic structure. And it was based on that we were able to put the $3 million into the theater.
So who initiated these loans from the county?
They're not loans, they were grants.
Well, grants.
Well, technically, remember what
Who
I said,
initiated
the county
the
owns the
relationship.
building. So
Right.
it was an easy lift for the county to be able to say, we can put $3 million into that building because we technically own it.
Okay, but Sellers first owned it. He owned
Sellers first provided the security to acquire it
Right.
by the cultural center.
Right. But then it was sold to the county.
Correct.
So how did that happen? Did Sellers approach the county? Did John Lynch?
My recollection of that, at that point, that was a John Lynch brainstorm.
Okay.
At that time, you may recall Lee Fagioni. Lee Fagioni was a J&J executive at that time who
Okay.
was, I think, she had been a J&J executive who had retired, and she was the executive
Correct.
director of NBT.
Ted Hardgrove mentioned.
You
it.
mentioned it, Lee?
Yeah.
Yeah, she was an example of what J&J, aside from a lot of things, contributed to the city. A lot of executives who had been involved with the city while they were J&J executives, once they retired, remained involved, and she acted as executive director for NBT.
Okay.
And I know that she was a mover and shaker with that, so was John Heldridge. And I think I would credit John Lynch for the brainstorm, because
Okay.
that's the kind of thing that he would figure out. And also be able to convince the county to do it.
Right.
Which is what that's why John was so important in the process, and I'm prejudiced because he did so much for me, but his leadership, his vision, his strength of character, and his ability to impose his will, if you will, on people, because of, he was a man with tremendous ability, insight, instincts, and he's the smartest guy I've ever dealt
Yeah.
with. So he had the ability to pull the things together that were needed, including, the ability to move the county in the direction that it needed to go. And that's an example of that.
Right.
And I think that, obviously for us who are in the city, what's happened with the cultural center is, it is maybe the single most important thing that is in place today that will allow the city to remain what it is. Because if you don't have it, you don't.
Can you speak some on George Street and Crossroads as well?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that I in my mind that I remember that told me that I was getting old was that I negotiated on Devco's behalf the original lease agreement with Eric Krebs for the George Street Playhouse to move from George Street into the Y building. And the reason that I knew I was getting old was because I was also still there when the lease expired, and it was a 20-year lease. I said, I am getting old because my signature is on that lease as a witness when it was signed, and now it's expired. It's 20 years old.
So were you involved when he was in the building across the street from J&J?
Yeah.
Okay.
What was that,
Yeah.
the Acme or something?
Yeah, it was the Acme. Was I involved? I was involved only in that I had been there.
Right.
And I had met Eric, and I knew Eric, but I didn't have any legal role in that until we were now, as the attorney for Devco, negotiating the agreement to get him to move over to the Y building.
Okay.
And Devco was very much involved in that process. At that time, Devco president was Paul Abdallo. He was still president then. And I recall a lot of the negotiation because Devco at that point in time had taken over the management of the Y building because we were now in the process of converting the Y building into the theater. And that was one of the roles that Devco played was, they didn't just build buildings, sometimes they were just the facilitator to get projects like that done. And Devco did really manage that whole process of getting that converted into
and bringing Crossroads.
Crossroads. The Crossroads saga is a long and winding one. I mean, Crossroads, to their credit, I mean because of the genius of the originators of Crossroads, they created theater out of their own genius. But that's only a part of the battle. You got to be able to operate. You have to be able to have a facility. You have to be able to manage it. You have to be able to maintain it. And those are always the struggles for any arts organizations. And they initially, of course, were in the King Block building. They were in the upper part of the King Block building. And the question was, we need to preserve them as an entity, but they need to have a place to live. The King Block was not going to remain there. Plus, it couldn't be a long-term solution for them because it really wasn't suitable for it. It wasn't accessible. It wasn't big enough. It didn't have the type of support areas you needed. So I think everyone felt, in good faith, we needed to be able to assist Crossroads in getting itself a new home. And I think the Crossroads building is probably an example of how you could be almost too successful because through some, various ways of trying to finance the new building, we were able to get monies from UDAG repayment funds. I don't know if you're aware of that, but part of how they were financed was through the repayment of UDAG monies from the Hyatt Hotel, because originally there was $6 million in UDAG monies in the Hyatt, and those monies were ultimately repaid by J&J. City got those funds back. City then put $1.5 million, I think it was $1.5 million of UDAG funds into the new building. And so, everyone agreed that Crossroads needed to be home, they needed to be in the district.
John Lynch was involved with that decision.
I'm sorry?
John Lynch was involved with that.
Yes. And I think that, unfortunately, I think what we learned, and at least that I think that most of us have learned is, you still need to look to see the long-term operational plan. Who's going to operate it? Who's going to be minding the store? You need, I've learned, I think, Thea, we've heard this sitting on boards, and that is that, your artistic director shouldn't be your managing director because, a managing director has to be there to be able to watch the bottom line. And I think the problem is the building itself that was built for Crossroads was probably too expensive to manage and maintain. And so it was inevitable that there would be financial crises, irrespective of how good the art is. And I think that we've learned when we look at the Crossroads building today, although it was very much a success story and it was a home that everybody could be proud of and still could be proud of, it's just really not feasibly, operationally successful for a theater like Crossroads, which is, it's hard enough to raise monies just for the art, but to raise it to manage buildings makes it very difficult. And it's a lesson that I think we've learned as part of our arts education and our arts maturity, in that as we today look at building new theater space for George Street and new theater space for Crossroads, and to look to this new performing arts center, we're looking at how we're going to manage the bottom line, which is just as important, if not more important, than how we're going to raise the money to build it. And that's every arts organization needs to look at that first. And I think we've really been successful here as the Cultural Center Board, and then as the State Theater Board, and ultimately I think again we will be one board again managing all of these facilities. You have to have a plan in place to be able to have operational money that you know you can count on year in and year out. And one of the things that we're looking at today as part of that new Performing Arts Center plan is a dedicated revenue source for operations.
And what might that be?
Well, through and again the efforts of I think some of the real good thinkers in this town, which I would include Chris Palladino at Devco to be one of those. To me, I think he's a genius. He's a little, he can be fun to deal with sometimes, but I think he's a genius. The idea of creating a combination of things. First of all, the dedicated airspace to do the office and residential component, probably have a dedicated revenue source for this. Also looking at some ways with the city to dedicate.
So was there in fact some sale of development rights?
Well, not yet. That,
but it's
structurally, the plan would be to do that, yes, would be to be able to sell air rights to a residential developer, or just Devco itself, or in conjunction with a developer, could do it on its own, and then the revenue from the sale of units would be dedicated to the theaters.
Which is how some of the Broadway theaters have been preserved.
Correct. And also, office commercial space in the same location. It'd be nice to have a major corporation or office user there, because it's the same concept, to be able to have those funding sources available to us. But also, I think the city is looking at the possibility of being able to dedicate certain revenue sources from the city to operations for this, whether it's through the special improvement district, or whether it's through what I refer to as tax increment financing. I think there's another term for it today, but I always still refer to it as tax increment financing. And
only New Jersey would quote what a revenue enhancement district.
Right.
Because no one knows what you're talking about.
Right. But those are the kind of things that I think we, and I say we collectively as the city of New Brunswick, have learned through 30 years of experience, that these are the things, when we move forward with these initiatives, we've learned from mistakes in the past. And you'd like to think that we can pass those on to other towns. I don't know whether or not you can, and I know it's one of the references here.
Yeah.
Can you take this model and stick it somewhere else?
Is it transferable?
I don't know that it is.
I guess you've spoken about the political stability.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's absolutely unique, but bringing together of a major university, major corporation, ultimately a major hospital. I'm just trying to think of,
absolutely.
Of the unique.
And they're all here, for better or for worse. The hospitals, university, county government, the major corporations, particularly J&J, they're here. They have as much of an interest, if not more than most, to make certain that the city is successful. I think the most difficult part of that is to have the community at large equally share in that, in the neighborhoods, in the social services that are provided, and it's the most difficult thing to achieve.
How do you think that has worked out?
How do I think it's worked out? I think there has been success. Has it been as successful? Very difficult to judge, because I think it's a long-term test. And you also, it's easy to say, we built this building, doesn't it look great? It looks great, it must be successful. But we've learned that that's not necessarily true. You look at Crossroads and it looks successful, but was it really successful? Is a building? Probably not. Its intended use? Probably not, because it created issues for Crossroads. Have we been successful on the social side of this? I think to a great degree we really have. But there's a lot more that needs to be done, and it's difficult to do. I mean, if you look at...
Can you speak about some of those?
Yeah, if you look at NBT, for example, when we look at all the social programs that have taken place through NBT, they've by and large been very successful. I think a lot of people have benefited from those services that in many cases, gone unnoticed, unrewarded, uncredited, if you will. And not that they need to be. But what do we do what do you do in terms of neighborhood stability? You know, I can go around from neighborhood to neighborhood and see the differences from when I first moved here 30 years ago, and I say there's been tremendous success. But if you go down a street in a particular day and there's a lot of garbage and debris around, you say, well, gee, we haven't done anything in the neighborhoods. That's not necessarily the case. Some of that really is, you know, the people who live in areas have to be invested in it and feel they're invested in it as well. And I think that's a harder thing to sell. I think that I would like to think that there was some more that we could do to promote home ownership and home occupancy, because I think people who are invested in their homes feel, you know, more attuned to the city and more attuned to their neighborhoods because they have a real investment here. But I think there have been programs over the years that the city has been able to initiate through funding that's available, and they have been largely successful, but it's not as easy to do. Like, I don't know how else to say that, but I think it's harder to figure out a way that we can make that happen. I like the idea that the university, at least at this point, intends to be more proactive in cooperation with the city, in going into the neighborhoods for the first time really ever, in my view, in trying to do some kind of coordinated, cooperative housing initiative, which maybe finally will allow students to live within the neighborhoods and not be adversarial to the residents and feel part of those neighborhoods rather than being, you know, being a problem in the neighborhoods.
How do you do that?
I don't know. It'll be a work in progress.
Right.
I think the fact that the university wants to do it, rather than just build a dorm here, a dorm there, or a dorm over there, I think we can see from the limited things that have already happened that it can be successful. For example, I think building Rockoff Hall, which was done through cooperation with the university and the city and New Brunswick Development Corporation, has been a great success. I think it's been a great success because I think the residents in Rockoff feel part of that neighborhood there. And I actually was thinking about it yesterday because I'm driving down George Street, and obviously students are just now starting to move in again. And I'm watching them walk around or walking downtown. They're going into the stores that are right there. They're sitting outside, they're chatting with each other. We need that in the downtown, and we need that more in the neighborhoods. But it can't be done on really just as a piecemeal kind of thing where a student finds an apartment on their own because some homeowner now has moved somewhere else, and the building that they used to be someone's home is now, you know, multifamily dwelling. And I think that although some landlords keep multifamily dwellings very nice, others don't. You'd like to think with a more coordinated effort where there can be more of a marriage between renters, whether they're students or non-students, with the homeowners who are still within the neighborhoods, I think is a very difficult thing to achieve. I'd like to think that we could do more to make that happen. I know that, you know, one of the things that people can be critical of, and I think we see that today in the initiative that may be on will be on a ballot this year, but award system, is the feeling that, you know, the focus of the city has been only on the downtown and not in the neighborhoods. I think in some ways that's unfair, but I can understand why that's a criticism, because you look at the physical manifestation, and sure, that's true. But it also ignores the fact that through the efforts, and because the city has a reputation now of having been successful in its efforts, we've been able to attract significant amount of money in redeveloping our schools. I mean, we're about to open a brand new high school. Who else can say that? We've opened up a brand new school in Lord Sterling School. We've had significant expansion of the McKinley Neighborhood School. We saw the development of the Paul Robeson School 15 years ago and to become a community school. So there has been a lot of work that's happened within the town that's geared to the people and to the neighborhoods. But I think sometimes that goes unnoticed because of the high profile of what we term to as the downtown.
Before we leave the subject of schools, New Jersey's grappling with,
Sure are.
how do we own up with all this billions of dollars?
I know.
You mentioned some of those efforts, those school projects. Are there, takeaway lessons from, New Brunswick experience in delivering these schools?
Well, I think the one thing
that others can learn from.
Well, I like to think one of the things that I like to say that I'm kind of proud of as part of the city is, again, we've attracted some pretty special, talented people. And in my view, maybe it's a little tainted, I look at Chris Palladino and Devco, and again, the interconnection that someone like Chris has had in state government, and the ability to be on the cutting edge of saying, you know what, we're going to show you that you should make city, at New Brunswick, the city where you do your demonstration schools. Think of what happened. Lord Sterling was a demonstration school. The high school was a demonstration school. So that we were in front of the line. And so what's the lesson to be learned? Well, some of it is you got to understand and be positioned to be there to, in the initial wave of things. Just like, when I talked to Chris Palladino, when we talked about stimulus money, right away, you think to yourself, let's look at all the things that we can look at in the city and really in the county also, where we can attract more than our fair share of stimulus money. Again, a lot of it is about identifying resources, being able to manage those resources and put them to the best use possible. Again, it doesn't mean that every project has been successful, but I think for the most part they have been, and a lot of it because of that kind of thinking. I think of examples of projects, for example, and again, with every project, there's always back and forth, and there's always, the underlying things that happen where there's disagreement and tension. I mean, you get a lot of that. It's not everything. It just is, roses every day. But a lot of times you have to look at it and say, look, maybe it's not perfect, but let's get it going because it's really a good idea. It could be better, sure, it could be better, but if we wait to make it perfect, it's not going to happen. And in a lot of ways, doing things on an ad hoc basis like that, I think has served us well. I think that, you look from, if you look at the city and say, okay, we're going to do this, and this is going to be our plan, and this is where you're going to put this, and this is where you're going to put that, it's great in concept, but it may never happen. You have to take advantage of what's available to you and just do it. And then you adjust. If your plan called for your cultural district to be here, well, it's still going to be there, but maybe this theater gets built here and it doesn't get built there because this site's available and this one isn't. Don't be so myopic to think that you can't adjust because you got to strike when you can. And I think the city has always been able to do that. And again, I say to you, and I said it in the beginning, that has to do with political stability. Now, I use the term political, it's really governmental stability. It's not the politics, it's the government stability.
Well, the county also had stability.
Absolutely. The county, the city, if you knew, look, this is a great idea, this is a good project, but we need the county to do this, we need the city to, you can get it done like that. And there's not a lot of places where you can say that. We've had the good fortune of being able to have that as an asset for us. And, at the same time, knowing that you had these other, core assets and people working together, the hospitals. I think a lot of the people at the top in the leadership positions saw, for the most part, that the vision worked. And so, again, there's pulling and tugging. How far can a hospital extend into the neighborhoods before it's detrimental? How high can you build a building without really impinging on the neighborhood? The traffic that's generated because you're building too large a parking garage. Those are things you fight about every day, all day. And what makes my job so much fun as a lawyer. And there isn't always agreement on those things. But I think in the end you looked at it and you trusted the leadership, you trusted the people that were in position in decision-making positions, whether they were elected people, appointed people, or hired professionals, and you trusted it. You debated it, but you trusted at the end that the people that were brought on board were making right decisions. Now, again, I think that I'd like to see us be able to do more in the neighborhoods. I'd like to see us be able to really push initiatives. It's difficult now because the economy the way it is, you just don't have those extra resources. But I'm confident that the people that are here,
So
we'll find a way.
See done in the neighborhoods, when let's say times get a little better.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, from time to time, there has been initiatives that have been discussed generally about going in and doing infill housing, going in and, trying to take certain sections of the city and doing it, on a, kind of a demonstration type of thing through different developers who can bring, who have expertise in doing tax credit financing or doing, going to the HMFA and finding, special types of funding. And, some of the people who were the best at that, because from experience, liked to migrate to New Brunswick because they knew if they had an idea, you weren't going to be battling every day because, you don't have the leadership or the stability. So we did attract, I think, a certain number of those developers. And I think we probably, a lot of those times those projects are more marginal in terms of success or not. So I think in times like this where the economy is what it is, those kind of things just, those types of developers pull their wings in, and it's difficult to get that initiative going again. But I think it will. I mean, I just think it's a cyclical thing that will happen. And again, we have had a lot of residential and neighborhood initiatives that have worked, and I point to the schools as an example, but there's also been housing initiatives, whether it's senior housing initiatives. I look at the Providence Square, which was the cigar factory, now it's a senior building, and now it's going to be expanded senior building. You're going to do more units there. So there has been a lot that's happened to service seniors, and we've been able to, in the city, attract dollars to do park improvements, to do recreational improvements, and so a lot of that has happened in what you would call an urban area, which you may not see in places, other urban areas, but we have been able to do it. Some of which is because of credibility with the city and knowing that if we're going to commit $1 million to the city, it's not going to get wasted. It's going to go to good use, and I think I think it's we have good people engaged in that process, and again, the leadership, from a 30-year period, it's interesting to note that there's not been a lot of change in the people. You can count, the people, on two hands perhaps, who have been involved for such a long period of time, that have a historical perspective of it, but also still stay very much involved in it. Makes me laugh. I think Chris Palladino has actually been Devco president almost 15 years. I find that really surprising that he's been here that long.
Right.
He has been.
We did talk to Chris Folio as well.
Yeah.
We're seeing Chris tomorrow. Chris Palladino tomorrow.
Well, he's an interesting character.
Yeah,
Chris
I know
Folio
Chris.
was interesting because Chris, and Chris is an example of someone who actually cut her teeth in New Brunswick, and yet went on to play a major role in the state, and yet, since she knew New Brunswick, was able to help get resources into New Brunswick in her role at the HMFA. But I have kind of pleasant memories of Chris when she was still working in the planning department, and I was doing land use, applications, and again involved with Devco, and then ultimately she came and, she was the president of Devco for a period of time, and she and I worked closely together.
She's a former student of mine.
Oh, is that right?
So,
Chris,
nice to see.
one of those people, very talented, very bright, very bright. And fortunate that, she's someone who ended up early in her career in New Brunswick and played a very major role in New Brunswick. Good person.
Are there other people?
By the way, she's now in a place with much more difficult. Trying to
In
turn
Trenton,
Trenton around is
I
not the
know.
same as trying to turn New Brunswick around.
Are there other people, I mean, you've mentioned some other people who were on the Devco board initially. I don't know what their status is, if they're available. We know
Well, I
that
think-
that Dick Sellers is no longer apparently. John
he-
said he didn't think we could.
You probably, if anybody can get Dick Sellers, it's John.
Yeah.
But probably not. I think Dick Sellers is now 92.
Right.
think he's 92, I think.
But you mentioned some of the first, now how about Bill Tremaine?
Well, Bill Tremaine
and
is
Lamb
around.
Hill?
I
Are
don't-
they people you think we should talk with?
I don't, well, Lent Hill probably he has not been involved in the New Brunswick process for a long time.
But he was one of those initial
He was on-
bankers?
Yes.
Okay.
Which was I think it was what was the name, the National Bank of New Jersey. That's
Oh, New Jersey.
very
okay.
beginning, but that's what ultimately, that's the bank right at Church and
Yeah,
George Street.
Right.
Which is Wachovia, now Wells Fargo, whatever it is.
Right.
When they were local.
Yes, yes.
yeah.
I think that, Roy Epps has been, and I don't know if you've
We
spoken
have
to Roy
talked
Epps.
with Roy, yeah.
Roy is one of those individuals who's been around longer than myself, as part of the Urban League, now Civic League.
Some neighborhood people that we should speak to?
Gee, that's an interesting thought. Neighborhood people that have been involved, been in the city a long time, I'd have to think that through a little bit. Interesting if you look at the MBT board members going back maybe 20 years or so. Because a lot of people on the MBT board that were more involved in the social service aspect of the city.
Okay.
But just talking about neighborhood people, someone like an Angie Paleo, even though, she was the political chair, Angie is a lifelong New Brunswick resident. She has been around, forever. Don't tell her I said that. But knows the city from the time
How
that
do
it
you
was.
spell her last name?
Paleo, Puleio.
Oh, okay.
But there are others. I can actually give you some thoughts on people
Okay.
that have been kind of on, have been in the city, have, worshipped in the city, have lived here and
Mhm.
have seen things that have happened, and give you some names of those people. 'Cause,
Actually, it was that interesting connection of people who moved from New Brunswick, who basically kept ties.
Mhm.
They moved to Highland
Highland
Park.
Park.
Right.
They worshipped in New Brunswick, so
Correct.
Right.
you still
That's
had
right.
that tie to the
That's
city.
right. I hope that you actually talk to some of the restaurateurs, because I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
Because they are, we've become such a destination city.
Mhm.
And it's kind of ironic that, we're in the midst of a charter change question on the ballot, where people are challenging whether or not there should be a ward system, and being critical of the city because all it focused on was the downtown. I mean, that's the theory of it. Yet, the city has become a destination.
Right.
Many of the very people who are taking that position have moved here because they like New Brunswick. In my mind, it's always kind of ironic. You move here because you like it,
Uh-huh.
and now when you're here, you want to change the way the city functions. It's a fair question, but, I look at the restaurateurs, and I look at, they've come in here, and I'd be even interested myself to know their view. What did they see that made them say, I'd like to invest myself into the city, my business into the city? I like to think a lot of it has to do with things that we were so involved in, which was the theaters, and we become, such a destination city.
Well, the owner of what was J. August passed away. He had been a student, right?
Another student.
Snyder?
I didn't even know that. Dick Snyder,
Yeah.
Richard Snyder, is that what
He
it is?
died, right. But the owner.
Jim Black.
Jim Black.
Speak to Jim Black.
Yeah, that's,
Jim Black it would be
At the
a
Frog
classic
Speech.
person to interview, and I'll tell you why. Jim Black originally, it's interesting how this whole thing came about. Jim Black was against a lot of the revitalization efforts early on, but for a simple, fair reason. He wanted to put his restaurant in the middle of the Hiram Market, what we'll call the Hiram
Mhm.
Market,
Mhm.
okay? The Development Corporation of the city viewed the Hiram Market as one that needed to be developed for residential purposes, and there really was probably, you couldn't envision putting a restaurant in the middle of that. Jim Black persevered, he and his wife persevered. They bought the property. They didn't give it up, it wasn't taken in eminent domain. They established their restaurant and literally caused the redevelopment process and the development of Riverwatch to develop around them.
mhm.
Yet today, if you look at it, it was the best thing that happened, because it's a tremendous restaurant. They've done a fantastic job. It's an asset to the city. It's a credit to him.
Which restaurant?
Frog and the
Frog and the
Peach.
Frog
Peach.
and the Peach.
And it actually, from a development standpoint, it's great.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it, it's just, today's, if you were going to develop, center, this town center concept, that's what you would do.
Right,
But 25 years
It
ago,
was a
you didn't
different
look at it
planning
that way.
concept.
Right.
Different planning.
right.
So he persevered. He's been through the redevelopment wars
Mhm,
as against them and then as part of it.
mhm.
I have tremendous respect for him. He's a friend. He's someone, when you go in there, he's a friend. But we were on opposite sides for many years, and so it shows you how things do change, how your perspective can change. It shows you that sometimes what you think is right isn't always right, and you have to be open-minded about it. I think that we're fortunate that he fought the fight that he fought,
Mhm.
because the city is much better because of it.
Mhm.
And New Jersey Monthly, it's kind of interesting. Top 25 restaurants in New Jersey. 3 of them are in New Brunswick. One is the Frog and the Peach, which has been in that magazine for the last 20
Right.
years.
Right.
And the other 2 are less than 2 years old. Kind of weird. Daryl's is only less than 2 years
Oh,
old.
is it?
And Dumari is
Stage-
less than a year old.
Stage left.
Nice, they make it this year, but they deserve to be
Oh,
there.
Dumari, right.
Dumari, it used to
right.
be Novatera.
Yes, right, right.
And
Wow.
And I think it's fascinating when you look that the city has become such a restaurant destination.
Right.
Due to no small reason as a result of the cultural center and the
Right.
efforts that all of us have put into that.
Mhm.
But they're a destination in and of themselves, and I give Jim Black a tremendous amount of credit for
Mhm.
that, because he was the first. I mean, Jay August was also
Yes.
there, but if you look at what Jim did and created a restaurant from scratch,
Right.
and consistently over the last 15 or more years has been one of the top restaurants in New
Mhm,
Jersey,
mhm.
and really makes, in my view, that river
What was
luxury.
in that building before?
I don't recall.
It wasn't,
For the
was it
long-
residential?
For the longest time, it was vacant. I think it was a
Okay.
commercial building. For a long
Okay.
time, it was vacant.
Mhm.
And I always recall them painted on the side of the building as an act of defiance. He painted "Gone Fishing." I don't know if you remember this. He painted on the side of the building "Gone Fishing."
Vaguely.
And I always wondered what he meant by that. Well, eventually somebody said, well, he's going to do a restaurant. He's going to serve fish. He's gone fishing. Well, you might, if you interview Jim Black, you should ask him what that meant. Because
Okay.
it was an act of defiance, but it was, to me, it was, that's an example of how you really do have to be open-minded, and the process can change, and you're not always right about it.
And was J. August Cafe, was that building previously a restaurant?
J. August, originally, I don't recall where he was first, but he did move on to Church Street in one of the buildings that still remains as part of the Kilmer Square.
Oh, okay.
But
The lower
it's the
area.
next to last building, I think, at that time. It
Right.
might be where the tobacco store
Where
is
the
now.
tobacco store is?
And,
I think he started, he was a plant store. And then,
Yeah.
And then it was almost like,
Yeah.
well,
Then he
have a
sold-
little lunch something.
Oh, okay, right.
yeah, and he did a great job, he really did.
Mhm.
Well, he ultimately, in fact, I think he was down in Riverwatch, and he moved over to Church Street, so he did
Oh,
reach an
okay.
agreement where he moved there.
I
That's how
see.
he ended up there.
Okay.
And,
Hmm.
a lot of people don't realize that in that Kilmer Square Mall, there are about almost half of that block is still buildings that were original
Yeah.
buildings.
Kenneth Wheeler told us about his role in trying to preserve parts of that building, like what Old Bay is in.
Yeah.
I don't know how
They
true
spent a ton
that
of
is,
money.
but, yeah.
No, it's true. There were issues with that building, and the several buildings with it.
Mhm.
Should they be preserved? Should they not
Mhm.
be preserved? Is it, are they structurally sound and
Mhm.
capable of being
Actually,
preserved?
another unique factor was the availability of UDEX.
Yep.
There was a window
Yep.
to use for commercial development, a block grant
Mhm.
of substantial size, and I
Yeah.
think New Brunswick was about, on a per capita basis, the second
We were the
largest
second,
recipient
yeah, I
or
remember
something
that
like
statistic. We were the second
Mhm.
largest per capita in the country. And I do remember the $6 million in the State Theater,
Right.
in the State Theater, in the
In
Hyatt
Hyatt.
Hotel.
Right,
That was a $6 million Hyatt
right.
grant what, 30 years ago?
Yeah.
I mean, or
Yes, it
whatever.
was.
I mean, that
And
was-
ultimately got repaid and reused, which is, you know, which is why that's such a success story, because it got used more than once.
Right.
Um,
We also have contacted Leo Molinaro, who we were supposed to meet, and then his wife got ill, but we hope to see him. And Bill Wright is gonna come up sometime.
Oh, that's great.
He's now working for a consulting firm that it turns out is Ginny Records firm.
Is that right?
Right. And Henry Cobb, who's the partner of IMP.
Oh, really?
So we hope to see him. He's delayed it a few times.
Maybe we can talk to Nero over the phone. He's
Frank
down in
Nero?
Florida. Frank Nero, yeah.
Yeah, Frank was, I worked with Frank for a long time, you know, side by side at Devco. I guess he's still in Jacksonville? I think he's in Jacksonville.
Is he the Wyoming person?
I thought it was in Florida.
Somebody, former mayor moved out to
Dick
Jackson Hole.
Mulligan.
Oh, okay.
Dick Mulligan was the mayor from 1974 to, I think, 1976, and then he went out to Jackson Hole, and that's when Gilbert Nelson was appointed as the
And then
acting
when
mayor.
was Pat Sheehan?
She was before that.
Oh, she was before.
Pat was the mayor
Okay.
from
Right.
maybe 68 to
68.
74.
And then she went to Community Affairs.
Yes.
And then there was an acting person for a while.
Right.
And then Mulligan came in.
Yeah, Dick
When Ed
Mulligan.
Blaustein was president, I had a class interview the people attending the State Theater. You know, just we did a simple zip code distribution, and you saw what a large area was drawing from.
Yeah.
In contrast, we interviewed shoppers then on George Street, which of course was all local.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then, you know, the idea was how can you capitalize on
Right.
that
Mhm.
big draw, which is hard. I mean, it took a while. You know, people would come to New Brunswick to dine only when there was theater. It took a while to say, no, I'm coming to New Brunswick to dine.
It's interesting to try to, when you look at it, what did New Brunswick make itself in terms of the downtown and its persona? Because I think one of the hardest things, and I don't think we have been completely successful at it, is to create true downtown retail.
Yes.
And
That's always been because I
If-
was on
if you
City
ta-
Market for a while too.
But if you
and-
talk to any developers, if you talk to any city planners, Leo Molinaro, if you talk to him, will tell you, it's the most difficult thing to
Right.
do. Because the major retailers have their own set of rules,
Right,
and they don't care what you say,
that's right,
they don't care what your statistics tell them,
right,
they need certain numbers, and if they don't have the numbers, they will not be there.
right.
And that was difficult.
At least there was some national chains. Took a long time, but you know, between Radio Shack and
Yeah. But you know, you
Dunkin'
wanted,
Inflation,
but
GNC.
you wanted to be able to get the major men's store,
Yeah.
women's store,
Or,
you know, the
yeah.
Gaps, the, you know,
Banana Republic.
Banana Republic, all of the, and get the major stores, and you just couldn't do it. It was,
So given the problems they're having, maybe it's best.
you might be right. Well, I know,
I
I
do
mean,
think a Jamba Juice would be good,
I-
and a Chipotle, but those are eating
well,
and drinking
Chipotle
places.
is opening up.
Where?
Omar Borai, the building he owns at Church
Really?
and George. Right
In that
here.
retail space?
That used to be the drugstore right on the corner. Church and George. It was the little
Church.
drugstore, Mandel's.
Okay.
Oh,
That's
okay.
Chipotle Grill is going in.
Great. Wow,
The,
that'll draw people.
Kilmer Square.
But again, it's a food place.
It's a food place. Kilmer Square would have been, you know, obviously was viewed as where you put the major retailers,
Mhm.
but it never happened. I mean, you would get some, I mean, I think Borai was able to bring the Gap in for a little while for a small store, but it was just difficult because
It was almost too early.
Yeah.
It was,
putting-
it was. And what do? You can't leave space vacant, so you go and you hope you get good solid individual retailers to come in,
Right.
and they've been there, but it's,
Yeah.
it's, you know, it's piecemeal, it's ad hoc, it's,
Right.
you don't know what you're gonna get. And sometimes you don't get the
We should-
best retail
You should
uses.
talk to the old man Rafferty people. Who might be? the
Yeah,
person
who
there?
was,
Mark Jacobacci,
Mark what?
Jacobacci, or Jacobat,
Mark
Jacobacci.
Jacobatsky.
Interesting. I
That's who, he's Old Man Rafferty's, and he's also,
Soho.
Soho.
Right.
He's
that's
one of
right.
those, touch it and it will work. He's very good at what
I
he
think
does.
he opened something in Asbury.
Yeah.
recently.
Oh, is that
He
right?
actually had talked about doing a steakhouse, but he ended up not doing that here, but, I mean,
But
everything he touches
Maddie's
turns
where, you know
gold.
Maddie with
Maddie
Steakhouse.
Terranova.
Yeah, I mean, he seems to be doing pretty well.
Matty Terranova, I knew and actually represented when he did the East Brunswick Fish Market.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
because
okay.
he actually, and a former client of mine, opened that East Brunswick Fish Market.
Well, we know Jack Morrison in Princeton,
Mm-hmm.
who was sort of his partner, and I'm assuming they had a falling out with his leaving there and coming
Yeah.
here, but,
I see Matty in there occasionally. I mean, his whole life is going to the fish market at
Yes.
4 or 5 in the morning. I don't know how he did that all those years.
yeah. Well, he and Jack Morrison did that. Jack opened Nassau Seafood in
Mhm.
Princeton, and Maddie had the East Brunswick place.
Yep.
And they have both built now restaurants based on
Yep.
that.
And it's good to have Steakhouse 85.
Yeah.
It's a very good place. I like it a lot.
Right.
And we needed that. One thing we didn't have was the steakhouse. I think the Raritan River Club was originally intended to be that,
Mhm.
but it really
But it
never
wasn't.
turned out to be that. Turned out very well that way. But I think we have. I mean, you look at it and we become the restaurant capital,
Right.
which is a good thing.
Which is a changing function of what
Yeah.
a city is. It's healthcare, it's arts,
Mhm.
it's unique restaurants,
Mhm.
not chains.
Well, I think what happens is there are so many people who converge on the city during the day because of the hospitals, because of the county seat, because of the university, that it's inevitable, they feel comfortable here in the day, they come back at night, they go to the
Mhm.
restaurants, they go to the shows,
Mhm.
and that's what we become. And I think that's a fine thing. I would like to see us be able to do more retail,
Yeah.
to complement it. I'd like to be
Well,
able.
as more housing comes, it may.
Yeah, and I think you see with some of the downtown housing, the Heldridge Center housing is critical.
Mhm.
I think the housing that I'd like to think that we're going to be able to do
Over the cultural center.
over the cultural center, the Gateway project, which is really almost literally ready to get started.
Mhm.
Now tying the university and the bookstore and the train station together with
Mhm.
mid-range housing, you're going to see more and more of that in the downtown. And then I think once you have that, then you'll start seeing the retail come. But you're right, the retail is the last thing you get.
Right.
Uh,
We're mindful of the fact that you get
Yes.
to go
Okay.
someplace.
Yeah, I know, that's, I appreciate, I don't know, is there anything specific you'd like to ask me that?
I guess if there are, records or, print that we can look at, if there, we're speaking
Do
to
you keep
people.
documents?
Yeah, no, I have
documents,
documents, I mean, I have a lot of land use stuff, but I have, things that, when we formed a cultural center and
Mhm.
when we did the state theater stuff that we have, I mean, I have those kinds of things if you.
I mean,
if
we
you
got
need
some
that.
initial funding. I actually felt compelled that we should get down and on record the oral explanations of the major leaders before they're too old to do so. So we got
Sure.
John Heldrich. It was unfortunately too late for Dick Sellers. So it just, one thing led to another, so we're now trying to be more comprehensive. But part of the project is supposed to also involve, collecting documents, or at least putting together a bibliography of where you can find things.
Mhm, that's
If other
great.
people want to do research.
So we started doing that, but that's such a massive effort.
Yeah. It
is.
So we're going to focus on.
Public
the-
Library, New Brunswick Library, Rutgers Libraries. John Heldrich has boxes, which he says he wants to finish going through, but maybe we can help him organize them, I don't know.
Well, when you think about the major leaders, though, with the exception of Dick Sellers, you're really getting, most of the people are still available to you.
Mhm. Andy Baglivo, we also talked to.
Andy's, been around from day one.
Right,
Uh,
right.
But most of those people are still available to you. I think
Yeah.
that's a fair statement. I mean, there are some that aren't necessary, but for the most part, most of them,
Mhm.
even, going back like to the Frank Newer or Paul Abdal, I mean,
Mhm.
I don't know if you reach out, but they're available.
Right, okay.
I'm sure if you needed to get in contact with them, you could.
Okay.
I'll be curious someday to hear the different perspective on what other people think. My view from where I was sitting and watching things as they were happening and being
Mhm.
involved, I mean, I can recall things that were happening on a day-to-day basis, and some of the tension of things. I mean, the argument, can J&J do more? Are they not doing enough? Are they committed? Are they not? And the tug of war over those types of things, but it all was all, you know, to get us in the right direction, I think that you know, John Heldridge will give you a great perspective, and Ralph's the same thing. But John, of course, John's been around, involved in so many different things. I just want to again say I was very fortunate because, you know, I can, and I did this with my children then when they were younger. You could drive around town, and I could say to them, "You see this project here? I was involved in that. I did the land use approvals. I could tell you stories." And I always say to them, "I could tell you stories," because with any project, with anything, there are stories. Some of them are amusing.
The stories are the most.
Well, they are, and some of them are amusing. Some of them you can tell. Some of them you can't tell. You know, the dynamic of what was going on. You know, the thought process of someone. You know, the tension between a developer or the city or whatever.
So maybe we'll come back and you can take us on a tour and tell us the stories.
Only the stories that I can tell, right. But for the most part, knowing and watching how things evolved over a period of time. And in some cases, and I think it's a fair statement, that some project just got done because, well, you know what, we can do it, so let's just do it.
Right.
You know, maybe not much more thought than that, but I mean, there wasn't, you know, knowing that it would fit into the big picture, but not necessarily because you were following this rigid plan.
Right.
You had to be flexible.
Right.
And I think one of the great advantages the city had was not being afraid to just go ahead and take that risk and do it.
Right.
And that was what I meant by, you know, you had governmental
Well,
stability.
it was an earlier conversation with Devco. They said, I guess, the building where Dunkin' Donuts is, they originally wanted to go into Newark. Newark was going, you know, going nowhere. They said, you know, we can package this deal for you.
Right, right.
And you have a plum of a tenant.
Yep. And that's really, a lot of times, it's just being able to be a salesperson, you know, and being, and now the city does have that reputation. Say, we want to be here now.
Right.
You know, there was a time, liquor licenses, you know, the city has always been known, it has so many liquor licenses. I think it's 84 liquor licenses. It sounds like a lot because, you know, the historic New Brunswick, you know, you had, you know, the corner tavern, the different. Now they're so difficult to come by because you have so many restaurants and so many, you know, upscale establishments. The liquor licenses are hard to find.
Wow.
And that's the changeover that happens.
Yeah.
And
that's interesting.
Hard to find means more expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, typically, which I don't think is a bad thing. You know, people are heavily invested in the city.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay, sure.
Yes.
And I'm sure I'll think of something else that I...
Well, it's fine. Eventually, this will get transcribed and slightly edited for corrections, and we'll send it to you to, you know, take a look at and make sure it reflects what...
So there'll be the written record, there'll be the video record, and then we want to take some of this, because no one's going to listen verbatim for these, like, roughly hour and a half interviews.
Yeah, I would imagine.
We want to excerpt it into something that hopefully can be in the New Brunswick Library and other places.
Be great, fantastic.
Right.
All right, well,
actually, we're looking for photographs, by the way. Before and after photographs for that?
I might have some things. I mean, I have, from time to time, I collected some. So, because myself, I actually went into the Rutgers library a number of years ago to look for old city photographs. Like when we were doing the Golden Triangle, and you know, I pulled out that picture because I wanted to make sure somebody had it. You know, the picture up that's over my mantle is a picture of this intersection in 1906.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and actually this building was under construction. You can see it on the side. It's kind of funny.
Well, it's like the old man Rafferty photos.
Yeah, but there's photos of even things that, a lot available, I think, for things in the 70s and in the 80s. All right.
Well, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me, and I appreciate it.
And I guess David's hoping that maybe we'll get some more student interest in doing some things in New Brunswick. I guess it's been a difficult thing to do.
Well, I've been the one who, in years past, would teach a New Brunswick studio class.
Yeah.
But it was almost, it was like, you have to have your audience willing to do it.
Yeah.
You know, I hope, because this would be a wonderful way to start excerpting some of these materials. And,
right.
Absolutely.
Where we came from, and now let's look at what's the next stage with retail.
Absolutely. Well, it's still